Transport for London is doing a review into the knowledge and of course its low applicant numbers. We've known this over years, it always gets mooted around and of course numbers get lower and lower, but I feel like this time it's different. As someone who works in the London taxi industry, as someone who's gone through the knowledge process, I think I can offer some suggestions on where the system can be changed for the benefit of people going through it and of course for the wider taxi industry. Now I think this all oddly coincides with the fact there is a new London Transport Commissioner, Andy Lord. Now I don't know anything about the political landscape here, what his thoughts and opinions are of taxi and private hire. All I know is that if you come into this position overseeing all of London transport, I'm sure he's going to want to shake it up in some way. So if he does happen to be watching, or one of his member of his team happens to be watching, just take some of this on board, please. So firstly, I want to address some misconceptions about the whole entire process. First off, why do we even have the knowledge? Because we have these things called sat-navs. Well, if you watch this channel for long enough, you'll know that most cab drivers will be able to beat a sat-nav hands down. Until a sat-nav has in-depth data points from every single traffic light on the road, from every single road user, from the bin lorry, from the pedestrian who's casually jaywalking across the road, then a professional navigator will be able to beat it every time because it has limited data points. It relies on people getting stuck in traffic for it to aggregate data. So there's kind of black spots, especially in a highly variable city like London. The analogy I will use, it's a bit like saying that a professional chef doesn't need to go to cooking school because we have cookbooks. Fine, anyone can follow a recipe in a cookbook, but the way a chef can just add a pinch of ingredients here and there, it's the same way that a taxi driver can do as well. Circumstances in London widely vary. What you drive at 10 o'clock on one day is not how you would drive at 10 o'clock the next day. Even 10 minutes apart, London can change sporadically. Another misconception is that you need the most superhuman memory to complete the knowledge. Well, I'll tell you right now, my memory is absolutely awful. I have notes in my phone to remind me to take my lunch to work, to remind me to defrost something, to remind me to put the washing on, etc. I think it's more about how you apply that information. You do not need a good memory for the knowledge. So believing that the knowledge is a process reserved for a select few people is complete rubbish. The knowledge itself isn't actually that hard. It's a bit like going to the gym and practicing in weight. Initially there's that point where you know nothing to then having a general level of competence, and then going forth it's much a rinse and repeat process. Again, the gym, once you've got your core exercises, it's all about the repetitions that you put in that yield the results. So I would argue that the only difficulty, if we're going to use the word difficulty, is the time span that it takes. Operating at the high standard and cadence that the knowledge requires for the examination for such a long period of time is what makes it difficult. Not the process of going out learning streets, points of interest, etc. That's the relatively easy bit. That just happens as virtue of repetition. The difficult bit is completing that repetition for such a long period of time. And over the years, that period of time has got longer as the knowledge has evolved. The process itself is antiquated within the age of sat-nav. Well, I would argue that it's actually more of a character building exercise than it is about learning the streets of London itself. Us taxi drivers will have a much higher regard for the job. We respect our badge, we respect our livelihood a lot more because of the in-depth process we've had to go through. It's no different than, say, a Navy SEAL going through an extensive process. They will relish in that achievement a lot more, have much more respect for that position, and so do the wider general public. At the end of the day, the taxi itself, the word taxi, the vehicle, it's a uniform, it's an icon. People don't look at that taxi and go, ooh, I wonder if they know where they're going. They see it's a taxi and know that they do know where they are going. In the same way that if you looked at a police officer in the street, you don't question the uniform and think, oh, I wonder how long he's been a police officer for. They have the requirements. By being in that position, wearing that uniform, that is the universal signifier of trust. So by simplifying or dumbing down the knowledge process in some way, has the potential to erode that brand and that trust factor that every single London taxi has. 25,000 streets and 320 runs. This is awful. We need to stop doing this altogether. Dean of Wizan Knowledge School pointed out the fact that we never have ever learned 25,000 streets and roads. But for some reason, it's the number that appears in every single news article whenever we talk about the knowledge. I don't know the exact number, but it's definitely below 10,000. My point count when I finished on the knowledge was about 7,000 points. And some of these are so obscure and have definitely fallen out of my head following this. By recycling these numbers that have never existed in any form of the knowledge, previous or present, we are giving people the right to believe that this is an antiquated process. I urge you now, if you're a taxi driver, or if ever you hear this number get spouted out there, don't agree with people and say, yeah, aren't I great, I've learned every single street in London, because you know it's a lie. It is a lie. We've learned a good amount of streets that are required for the job to reach the required standard of becoming a taxi driver, not 25,000. So please, disarm people if ever they want to use this, because it's a number that is used against us. In a similar vein, journalists latch onto the blue book. Now, part of learning the knowledge of London is that we have to learn 320 runs. This is kind of like learning our alphabet of learning the knowledge. Now, this is a required standard, but it's kind of like saying, oh, well, to have a grasp of the English language, students must learn 26 letters, and that contains vowels and consonants. Well, it's pointless. You have to learn the alphabet to be able to learn English, right? It's just the way it goes. If you're learning a new language, it might help to learn a phrase book. And then after that, you then go into much more fluent levels of dialogue. Same happens in the knowledge. You have a base framework of 320 runs, and then that eventually evolves into working knowledge of London. Allowing them to spout these 320 runs like they're just some arbitrary box ticking exercise is not on. It is just part of the learning process. It's a bit like saying to become a reasonably proficient swimmer, you have to get in and out of a pool 100 times. It doesn't matter. You have to just do that as part of becoming a good swimmer. If you want to become a taxi driver, you do those runs. So they're not, something that you can sort of exclusively have on their own. And then I believe a lot of people outside of the taxi trade will look in and think that taxi drivers themselves want the knowledge to remain difficult because it was difficult for them. Well, let me tell you, when I went through the knowledge process, that would have been the quote, most difficult time to do the knowledge. Why? Because it was the full length of suburban runs, because it's the most modern iteration with potentially the biggest amount of points an examiner can ask, and also we still had the redlining system. Redlining is akin to snakes and ladders. You could be at the very end of your knowledge journey, your standard slips, you can go right back to the beginning. That's how the red line kind of works. But it doesn't matter to me how the red line system worked because I never got redlined. So whether the red line system was there or not, I still just progressed through the knowledge in the same way. So the fact that redlining has been removed since I've gained my badge doesn't fill me with envy at all. I mean, it will do people who've been redlined. The moral of their story was if they just worked a bit harder, they probably wouldn't have got redlined and they would have got through the knowledge quicker. And let's look at the progress we've already had so far. Because TfL have already introduced measures to make the knowledge of London a much fairer, simpler and quicker system. It does not make the examinations any easier. These include the simplification of the suburbs, which I fully agree on. I did the longer suburbs, but never have I had a time in the taxi when I'm thinking, I'm really glad I learnt how to drive from Terminal 5 to East Croydon, road by road. I'm glad I learnt that suburb run down to Biggin Hill Airport or Pratt's Bottom. It just doesn't happen. As soon as I get anywhere outside of the main sort of central London area, sat-nav's going on because I don't know what the conditions are like outside of London in an area I don't drive. Central London, knowledge all day long. You're doing the stuff out on the edges, that's gone. It's far too variable. The sat-nav's definitely coming out in those examples. So here's some questions to ask about the state of where the knowledge is in now. Firstly, why has the knowledge got harder? We know this is correct because if you look back to, say, the 1970s, drivers were able to get their badge in about a year or so. From knowing nothing about London, doing their very first run to coming out with a badge took about a year. Whereas now, for me it took 3 years, but arguably I could say if I'd done a bit better scheduling, I could maybe got that down to 2.5 years or so. And even if you look at the absolute best case scenario of someone doing all the required processes, doing all the examinations correct every single time, it will be a minimum of 2 years. So what's happened? Well, I would argue that the knowledge of London itself hasn't got harder, but the circumstances surrounding it have. So first off, London is just a much bigger place. There is a lot more variables of points of interest, or what people deem to be a point of interest, that can be learned. More variables, more questions that an examiner could ask, more things that could trip up a candidate. Secondly, pre-2000, when it was the Metropolitan Police that ran the public carriage office, these weren't taxi drivers. These were a branch of the police. So someone with reputation and could be deemed to assess a good judgment of character. I believe, I don't know this firsthand of course, that the examiners, who were actually police officers, not taxi drivers, so they themselves may not have done the knowledge, they could actually expedite the process for candidates. I.e., if a candidate sat down in front of them and done amazingly well that day, they could almost fast track them to their badge because of just how impressed they were by that individual appearance. There wasn't the official system of scoring and testing like we have now. Bringing me on to point 3, that the current knowledge has a robust and reliable scoring system. This is great because it creates transparency between the examiners and the people who are sitting the test. You get your scorecard back, but you also get an assessment sheet which tells you exactly where you dropped points, where you could have improved, etc. You also know how far you are along the stages, whereas you may not have known that in times gone past. It was a much fairer system in line with kind of modern policies that you would expect if you was going for a degree or applying for any other qualification. This in itself creates time restrictions because the examiners can't expedite the process. They have to go through this official scoring system. Not saying that's bad, I'm just saying that's just the way it works, which potentially adds time over a previous system. And fourth and finally, I've touched on this, is that the examiners were not taxi drivers. They were the police. So they could be hoodwinked. They don't know London inside out. They'll have their own exposures to London, and of course, if it's their job, they're not necessarily going to go out on days off and pick up more and more points of interest, unless you was Mr. Orms.
I've got limitations, believe it or not, but not with the knowledge, however.
But the examiners there now have gone through the process, many years of studying. I imagine they all converse on different, road closures and things in London. And as a result, I think they're going to be less likely to be hoodwinked than, say, a Met Police examiner. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, but you've got to look at these kind of historical circumstances as to why people got through the knowledge quicker back then and why it is more of an officialised and probably a much more democratic process now. Now let's look at the options that I think TfL have available to them to get people on board with the knowledge. First off, why is there less people applying for the knowledge? Well, I think there's two factors at play here. First off, if you just look at life in general, I think there is far more options and competition that is available to someone who may want to become a taxi driver. You're not getting the sort of young blood come through anymore because, looking at my own personal circumstances, I was kind of funneled through the academic route. You go to college. If you leave college, you must go to university. And of course, when you leave university, you must take a graduate job. So it's a little bit unorthodox in terms of the way modern life is geared up towards that, somewhat of a con, I believe, is the academic system. So that's one part. Secondly, is that the process of becoming a private hire driver is relatively simple. And from the outside, it seems to offer exactly the same benefits. You can work for Uber, Bolt, etc. and come to work when you like. Very similar benefits to what the knowledge provides. I can't personally say what the earnings are like in comparison to a taxi driver because I don't know what the earnings are like. All I know is that you're going through a platform, and of course there's commissions associated with that. Surge pricing or not surge pricing can deeply affect how much money you earn and take away on a given day. But we can't deny it that it is obviously a huge swath of people who would have normally gone onto the knowledge. So that's potentially a good target customer, our target market of someone who should go from private hire over to the knowledge. I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. So, my idea for potential fixes. Well, I think that personally, TfL need to kind of stay away from the actual the examination process, because I think that is the tried and tested system, and work more on a marketing exercise, or potentially what other factors might attract people to become taxi drivers. Again, we know that the process is difficult, so it's not a case of let's just make it really easy so people are encouraged to do it. The actual job itself should have some encouragement or some benefits to it. And then of course you're willing to go through the hard graft because you know what the job is going to be like on the other side. With that in mind, I think TfL need to be able to guarantee the livelihood of taxi drivers. Why would you want to apply for a job if you don't know what the future looks like? This is probably reminiscent of the 1960s, seeing all of London Docklands and all the warehouses and stuff all closing down and the shipping routes and everything all kind of just gradually demising. Would that be a good time to get into becoming a docker? Probably not. But that's just from the outside looking in, seeing all of that whole infrastructure just get smaller and smaller. And arguably you could see the same with the taxi industry. Less cab garages, less places and cafes to stop, less toilet facilities, etc. So from the outside looking in, it doesn't look good. But I think it's up to TfL to be able to put in policy that's going to be able to inspire and attract candidates to the trade in the form of guarantees. Just look at it from a business perspective. What are big businesses doing right now in times of high inflation to satisfy and give customers confidence? Well, if you look at energy firms, they'll do price freezes. I had an email from my electricity provider saying that, look, we're doing everything we can to try and lower prices. Rather than me thinking, I'm going to shop around and look for the best price, they've given me reasons to remain confident about them. And that should be the same when you apply to do the knowledge. TfL should be no different. Instead of working against us, they should be working for us to be able to promote what that knowledge provides. It's incredibly difficult to invest if there's nothing but speculation in how it may pan out. So here's a few levers that TfL can pull. Number one, and this is the biggest one that's within their control, is to cap private hire numbers. It's simple. I don't get why there isn't kind of an upper limit or a number where they want to stop at. Like any big business, they should know what the overall aim and objective is. There's probably going to be some sort of Goldilocks zone of the amount of private hire drivers they can have in London. Too little, then of course you get people without transport solutions. Because let's face it, if we said let's get rid of private hire entirely, us taxi drivers would not be able to cope with the demand because they fill in a lot of gaps within the transport network and infrastructure. So we do need them in some regard. But when is the upper limit? If you go too high with a number, of course that creates congestion within London. And of course we know that big transport infrastructures don't like having cars and vehicles on the road. So why does TfL still feel the need to have this endless honeypot of making more and more private hire drivers? I think it'd be much better in their interest, and even for the third parties that are running these apps, such as Uber, Bolt, etc., to be able to have a finite number. If they have a finite number, that makes that private hire license much more lucrative. The people who have those licenses are probably more likely to stick with their license and renew more regularly, rather than TfL having to find an endless source of people to fill in that revenue stream. And I imagine for the private hire companies, if there's a much more stable number of private hire licenses, then they can fix their prices to a much more buoyant level. You won't see as much surge pricing going on and a lack of customer satisfaction because you know what the general number of private hire drivers should be. Secondly, a low traffic neighbourhood guarantee. How efficient I can drive around London as a taxi driver is directly correlated with the potential earnings. It might only be a small multiplier or a small variable. The less availability of roads I have, the more time it takes me to complete a job, means that I can't turn over jobs as quickly. It means I can't get the starting fare from every single job as quickly. I can't get a likelihood of a tip because if the customer's been stuck in traffic, they're less likely to tip. If I do more jobs, each job has a tip attached to it, I can earn more money. So this diminishes earning potential. And of course, confidence within taking taxis in general. If more and more low traffic neighbourhoods pop up, it's not good from the customer's perspective as well. I think TfL should be able to have more of a grasp on the local boroughs and being able to control what they do with their low traffic neighbourhoods. I understand that it does get controlled at a borough level, so it's not always within TfL's control, but if it's just something they can do to kind of promote the fact that their taxis, their own transport fleet, need access, that will provide more confidence in people to come onto the knowledge. If they see that every single low traffic neighbourhood that goes up, there's a little sign there that says taxis are allowed. It makes it a superior transport. It gives benefits to people who want to become cab drivers, but also people using the service. There's a clear distinction between taxi and private hire, which I'll come on to in a bit. Thirdly is control the cost of the vehicle. I don't know how they'd implement this, but as Transport for London set the kind of rules and guidance on what the vehicle must have to turning circle, disabled accessibility. They should be able to have more of an influence in keeping that price down for us drivers. The vehicle's always been expensive. It's a wonderful bit of kit. It's custom. It's unique. But it is a big block for potential entrance into the trade. In fact, I would argue that the high cost of the vehicle reduces the potential number of part-time drivers. It's pretty much impossible to be able to run this job part-time unless you've got a suitable way of sharing your taxi. The days of weekend rents or just being able to rent a taxi for a few days at a time are pretty much gone because garages want longer term contracts because the cabs are so expensive. We need to have a kind of middle option where short term becomes an option. Simple things like better resources for drivers. If I apply to a pretty good job, I'd like to think that the HR and some of their employee wellness and benefits are good to attract me to that job. Driving a taxi should be no different. We're reliant on private entities to provide resources for drivers. Lack of places to go to the toilet, lack of facilities. I mean, everything to do with your application is pretty much all online now. The closest thing that TfL provide to a resource for us drivers is either their phone and online services for when you renew your badge and the En Route magazine, which tells us things like how to breathe properly and manage our stress because they know that driving a taxi or private hire vehicle is a stressful job, where to go to the toilet, etc., because they don't provide these facilities. Everything else is then privately supplied, whether that be a taxi union, whether that is an independent cafe owner who has to pay exorbitant rents in London to be able to provide these. I mean, TfL has so much property across London. Why they can't repurpose some of these into hubs for drivers to be able to pop in, gyms, etc. All kind of employee perks that would attract people to becoming taxi drivers. You have to turn up to appearances wearing a full suit and tie, otherwise they'll send you home. There's a level of prestige in joining the taxi trade, but that soon falls out the window once you get your badge. You know, the suit then goes away, never to be worn again. You know, I love going for appearances because these were awesome, swanky offices, and you felt like a part of something. It was like going for a good interview or becoming part of a big company. But once you are a taxi driver, I guess it is the benefits of being self-employed is that you do work for yourself, but all that kind of, I don't know, HR, offices, infrastructure, all just falls away. You never see that again. You just leave all that prestige behind. We should also be able to get priority for taxi drivers. We're just kind of lumped in with private hire. I know Transport for London love this to a degree because they can simplify a lot of processes. For instance, if you go to an NSL booking site, it's the same booking service as used by private hire and taxi drivers, whether that's on the phone or on their online services. But when you go to an NSL site, taxis go up on a ramp. They get inspected underneath. So why is it that we have to go through more rigorous processes once we get to the NSL site, but we don't get any benefit like in terms of booking it? I think you could do that across the board with all resources for taxi drivers. Because what that then does is that it provides a clear upgrade from, say, driving private hire. If there was noticeable benefits, you would think, right, I'm going to progress up to that. And coming back to my original point, I think a lot of the people that would normally go on the knowledge to become taxi drivers are just within the private hire system. I mean, look at it from the point of view of a private hire driver. They've got a cheaper vehicle, so they could potentially work it part-time. Other than the English language requirements and, you know, a topographical test, there's not really much friction to be getting a private hire license, and you can still, you know, work as freely and flexibly as say, a taxi driver. A big company will foster growth within people that are within that company because they don't want retention. They don't want people to leave and come back. I'm sure Transport for London would just much rather that their entire workforce, in terms of us self-employed private hire drivers and taxi drivers, would just much rather renew their badge because that's a nice, easier, simpler system. So they don't really want people to leave and then have to find new people to come in, right? This is a problem they're now having. So let's look at it the way that a company does, right? If you've been with a company and they provided training packages for you to foster your development and growth as a model employee, they'll reward that or give you some kind of pathway to progress. If driving for private hire, if there's no kind of like next step, then people are just going to leave if they're not satisfied with that. Look at your example. If you're watching this and you're within a job, you want to see progression. If you're at a company where there is no progression, you're very quick to say, you know what, I've reached the top of the tree here, or company's too small, I'm going to leave. So I think they can do that with private hire. I think there should be nice demonstrable benefits that would, make taxi driving more attractive. They are our biggest target market. Now, if we look at the actual knowledge itself, what can we do here? Well, I think we could reduce the intervals between testing. For anyone who'd done it between the 70s up until the year 2000 when TfL came in, I believe that the intervals could be much shorter. On the final stage, you have to turn up every 21 days or every 3 weeks. But there did used to be a 14-day, which would be, of course, every 2 weeks. The thing is with the knowledge is that once you get to, say, the stage which is called 28, I think it's stage 5, you're kind of in the very middle of the knowledge journey. It sort of does become a rinse and repeat exercise. You've got pretty much most of the fundamentals of London. You can drive from one side to the other. You can demonstrate it within an appearance. It's absolutely fine. Because you're seen by a different examiner most times, it just seems like, I think that the time delay, the only thing it provides is the fact that that candidate has to carry on working to keep up that cadence. I think it could be trimmed down a bit. I mean, for instance, when I was on the knowledge, my first stage of 56s, which is every 8 weeks, were running at 6 weeks. And I think this is the case now because they've got less applicants on the knowledge. So they should just be able to regularly just reduce the time in interval. And of course, if more people apply, then of course they'll extend. So that in itself would make people get through the knowledge faster. And I think people have benefited from this, in the sort of post-COVID times as well, because less people in the knowledge, they can do that. But that should be something that's kind of actively promoted. Less people in the knowledge, you can get through it faster. They still get the same number of examinations. I had 13 exams, but no one really cares about how long the intervals were between, right? I've been independently assessed 13 times. So you're still getting the same number of examinations, the same number of questions as being asked. So that doesn't really change the knowledge process, and you're only going to be going for those shorter intervals if you are truly confident in your abilities. So if anything, that does actually promote a higher quality candidate because they're going to work harder to ensure they get those shorter intervals. And then the market in itself. Again, I don't know how we can sort of implement this because I think the biggest problem is that there's far too many other options in life that people can go and do now. Things like paid apprenticeships, people are going to flock to go become electricians or plumbers. Going to university, if you've gone through the academic system, it very much gears you up and kicks you straight over into university. I mean, I'm probably the best example of this. I did 3 years at university, came out with a first class with honours degree with about £22,000 in debt. As soon as my mortise board that I threw up in the air comes back down, I'm jobless. I've got nothing. I've got nothing to show for those 3 years. Whereas by comparison, the knowledge of London took me 3 years and I was at work that evening earning money. It just seems so bizarre to think. And no debt, I'm just straight out and working. So the benefits in some ways are quite clear, but it's just the way that society is geared up to kind of funnel us into certain directions because, of course, universities are big companies, corporations that rely upon students to come there. So you're never going to overcome the marketing behemoth that is some of these grand institutions that is the education system. My key point I want people to take away and think about is that the knowledge has always been difficult. It's never been a case of, it's too difficult, I'm not going to do it. Something else has changed because people are willing to go through this process. I would argue that probably in the 90s, there was far more people applying for the knowledge, but then quite a high dropout rate. Whereas I would say that in current times, the people that apply to go on the knowledge and stay with the knowledge process is a much greater percentage. I think people generally don't quit or give up. They stick with the process. I don't have that data. I think TfL need to delve deep into that as part of their proposals because that will tell whether the knowledge actually needs dumbing down or not. If you've made it this far, please do subscribe because that helps me get the message out there about how us taxi drivers operate, the realities of being a full-time working taxi driver, the costs, the hoops and hurdles we have to jump through to sustain our livelihoods. Such as discussions like these on the knowledge of London. And check out more of my content, share it with people because I break down more content like this. Thanks again. I'll see you again soon.